It's finally here, at long last. After 2 years of intermittent releases and various prototypes and hard copies put on display to generate hype, Devastator is finally here. Easily the crown jewel of the entire Studio Series line for most fans, this seems to be the single most ambitious combiner yet made by Hasbro and Takara, though perhaps he may be overthrown by Masterpiece Raiden whenever that's supposed to make itself known. It has been something I've been looking forward to for a very long time. Before we begin, I gotta say, man, I'm glad I never got the original Supreme Class figure from 2009. Welcome to Kit Katastrophe. My name is Kit, and today we'll be taking a look at Transformers Studio Series Devastator. This figure is a combination of 8 figures released from 2019 to 2020, and represents Devastator's appearance in the 2009 film Transformers Revenge of the Fallen. As a complete set, barring Skipjack of course, as I've said I'm not planning on getting him, the alternate modes of the Constructicons are a killer squad. While the team has some dodgier members such as Scrapper, Scavenger, and especially Overload, there are some absolute bangers like Rampage and Scrap Metal. I like how the colors are pretty consistent across the different releases. At least the yellows of Scrap Metal, Hightower, and Scrapper are all consistent, as are the reds of Overload and Scavenger, but Rampage is a little on the orange side, although I think he makes up for it with that gleaming silver blade. Given that they're spread across all 3 size classes featured in Studio Series, the Constructicons are given a nice variance in size. It's pretty cool putting small-time excavator Scrap Metal next to the heavy industrial Scavenger, and Long Haul and Overload look like quite the couple despite the compromised nature of their vehicle modes. You pretty much can't go wrong with group shots of these guys, as they all complement each other very well. Robot mode is where the Constructicons become a lot more of a dynamic team. Their overall aesthetic, in short, I would describe as consistently inconsistent, leaning heavily into the experimental and downright crazy design spectrum of the Revenge of the Fallen era that I will fillet until the end of time, unless I happen to choke to death first. Sure, you got the typical stock standard regular-ass robot guys like Scrap Metal, Long Haul, and Scrapper, who would fit pretty fine in the first film. Then things start to get a little weirder with Mixmaster's broad shoulders, Overload's extra pair of limbs, and Rampage's complete lack of legs. Then you go into what the fuck territory with the completely inhuman Hightower and Scavenger. While we're here, there's something I missed in my Hightower review. If you remove his crane boom and turn it around, you can make it somewhat more accurate to his concept art if that tickles your fancy. While in vehicle mode, the Constructicons seem to echo the purposeful, disciplined subunit of the Decepticon army that we all know and love. Their Bayverse incarnations are such a motley crew, with such inherent personality that I kinda want a whole television series about these guys, on their own, getting up to trouble. While in Generation 1 Scrapper seemed like the leader, or at the very least the first among equals, the Revenge of the Fallen Constructicons seem more like a family, or a close-knit clique with tons of potential for interesting interpersonal dynamics. Hightower can even be their pet. Of course, once one of those asshole Autobots decide to mess with the Constructicons, they go all out to get revenge. Channeling the rage and coordination only the bonds of blood can provide, Rampage and Long Haul throw themselves down onto the ground to form the feet and lower legs of the beast. Now, the official configuration has Rampage's stand pegging into Devastator's ass, but it can fit just fine in the same spot as it did in vehicle mode, which is my preferred option. Overload is the next to join, transforming into Devastator's lower torso and locking onto Long Haul and Rampage using specially keyed slots, meaning that you can't switch the legs around, though of course you can switch out Rampage for Skipjack if you prefer the added yellow. The slot used to lock Long Haul in is really awkward to use, so it takes me at least a half dozen attempts to get the two connected. Rampage slides in just fine, however, though both connections are extremely solid. The best way to continue the combination is by setting the legs aside and moving on to Scavenger and Mixmaster. Since I probably have a shit ton of time to fill during this segment, I might as well mention that balancing Devastator mid-conversion is actually a bitch and a half, since naturally his center of balance shifts whenever you add a new bit to him. The connecting points Mixmaster uses to lock onto Scavenger are the most bullshit, with hardly any way to reliably line them up before attempting a connection. Of course, once he's on, and he's extremely difficult to remove once successful, and the entire subassembly attaches to Overload using another sliding lock. The arms are the simplest part to add, slotting in using a system somewhat reminiscent to, but distinct from, that used in Combiner Wars. Combining scrap metal and Hightower with the rest of the bunch uses a touch of parts forming, namely the plank that comes with scrap metal should be placed onto Devastator's thigh, and Hightower's shrimp claw having to be taken off the crane boom and onto the back of his head. Of course, much like the rest of Devastator, the locking point joining scrap metal and Hightower is extremely tight. Normally I'd say something stupid and fam-wanky like, "Prepare for devastation," but the only Devastator quote from the movie is so I'll go with that. First impressions are everything, no matter the circumstances, and I'd have to say my first impression with Devastator was exulting, to say the least. This thing is easily the biggest combiner I have in my collection, and certainly has the most components. And while Devastator isn't quite as screen accurate as one would like, he's bipedal for example, I think he looks amazing. One thing I was pleasantly surprised by is just how sturdy the combine mode is. I swear, these connections will not be unlocking anytime soon, especially in the torso and legs. I could see the arms being a weak point, but in my experience, they've been sturdy enough. However, like I alluded to during the transformation sequence, Devastator has some balance issues. Oftentimes I find myself having trouble getting the combiner into a position that is both stable and looks good, and it's mostly due to the lack of knees, which was a necessary sacrifice to make for the sake of the combine mode. The problem is that the ankle joints on Long Haul and Rampage just cannot go back as far as I'd like them to, meaning Devastator is always just a tad front heavy. The face sculpt is nice and detailed, though considering the limitations of having to fit within Mixmaster's cab, it looks kind of squished and stretched forward, almost like a duck. The mouth can be opened, but he can't do the thing where he vores the whole universe, though I suppose that was an unrealistic wish. The neck sheath that comes with Overload snaps on tightly onto Mixmaster's drum and gives Devastator a very well-deserved pop of neon green up top. If I had to make some nitpicks about this otherwise great combine mode, I'd probably complain about how Rampage's tummy flap doesn't lock in behind Devastator's thigh, and Overload's wheels do a very ramshackle job of filling out Devastator's waist silhouette, though neither of these issues color my opinion of him at all. For what Hasbro set out to do at a retail budget, I'm very impressed. While Devastator may be limited in his articulation, at the very least he is not a brick. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't have anything at the head in terms of side-to-side rotation, but as I have shown before, his jaw can open and close. It can't spew outwards or anything, but that is good enough. The shoulders have a butterfly joint, thanks to Demolishor's various joints. It can move outward on a ratchet joint. It can swivel up and down. And the elbow joints are on a ratcheted swivel themselves, which allow for greater stability when posing his arms. Now, the two arms of Devastator are different, but they do feature a ratchet joint by the elbow to give some inward rotation, or curling rotation rather. The thumb, made up of Hightower's neck, has various joints, and the claw can come off by design. The wrist, for lack of a better term, can move thanks to it being on a joint on scrap metal, and the fingers can move on various hinges and ball joints to your pleasure. On Scrapper, the situation is much the same at the elbow, though the curling joint is a lot tighter and a lot louder compared to scrap metals, and there are just 3 fingers that have hinge joints and swivel joints that you can use like so. Now, I'm going to remove the arm so that I can show off the leg articulation, just so that Devastator is a little more stable in his balance, because balance is actually somewhat of a problem on this figure. I have mentioned that earlier in this review, so I won't go very far into detail over it. Devastator's hips are made out of Overload's shoulders, which means they can move forward and backwards on a ratchet joint, and they can move outwards on a ratchet joint. So if you have the patience and the sheer gumption to do it, you can make Devastator high kick, though I would advise against that, because if he falls over, you're going to cry. The thighs have a swivel on a ratchet joint that is rather tight. I don't really get too much use out of it because I don't pose Devastator very much. He doesn't really have any knees, like I've mentioned earlier. This is mainly for balancing, I suppose, but on Rampage, you can get a foot tilt, and it can go forward, and the waist swivel on Rampage can serve as an ankle joint, though a slightly limited one, and it is kinda loud. The same thing is not quite true on Long Haul. This is about as far backwards as you can get, and this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to pose Devastator, because this is very limiting, and it's not quite as tight as it is on Rampage, though, of course, your mileage may vary. These are just problems with my copies in all likelihood. And the foot can barely move forward either, just due to these big thigh pieces slamming against this truck piece. But the swivel is nice and healthy. So Long Haul is an extremely stunted foot, whereas Rampage actually gets the job done. I kinda wish they were given similarly keyed connections to Devastator's legs, just so that maybe you could get Rampage and Skipjack and have 2 functioning feet. Otherwise, Devastator is actually a fairly posable combiner, and it's actually kind of impressive what they were able to do in terms of articulation on this, though I do admit it does have its limitations. I've said it before, I'll say it again, and I'll say it 1,000 times. Studio Series Devastator is quite possibly the most ambitious project Hasbro has released to mass retail since perhaps Armada Unicron. Rendering a screen-accurate combine mode whose 8 separate components are all vastly different in design and execution is a noble goal, and while the final product stumbles in a few areas, I think the overall experience is worthwhile. I also have to say it was really fun to see these figures get released over the course of a whole year. There was a palpable sense of excitement that kept ramping up each time a new Constructicon was released, and it made me want to complete the set even more. Sure, there's the all-in-one box set coming out, but that doesn't compare to the thrill of the hunt in my eyes. But I think Devastator only deserves the rank of astounding. As fantastic and amazing as this combiner is, there are too many limitations in both the separate components and the full combine mode for me to grant him full marks. Though considering the only real alternative is Devil Savior's Troublemaker, I think this will be the best movie Devastator figure we'll be getting for at least a little bit. If you liked this video or otherwise found it helpful or informative, then please subscribe for more reviews like this in the future, and feel free to suggest topics for future reviews in the comments. When we return, it's back to Earthrise with a mighty crack of thunder. But before then, I'll be returning to Siege Mirage for a new kind of review. See you then. This has been Katastrophe. Transform and roll out.